Taiwan Halloween Stampede. Imagine this, you're in the mood for a night out dressed in your best Halloween costume, and you look like a really cool vampire. So you head to Taiwan in Seoul, where everyone buzzes about the Halloween celebrations. It's like the Coachella of Halloween parties, and the streets are packed. You see, Taiwan is a super popular area in Seoul, filled with restaurants, bars, and narrow streets. It's usually crowded on a normal day, but on Halloween night in 2022, crowded took on a whole new meaning. We're talking about over 100,000 people packed into an area that wasn't designed to hold anywhere near that many. Think of trying to fit an elephant into a sports car. It's just not happening. Now, when too many people are in one place, things can go wrong fast. It started with a few folks trying to make their way through a narrow alley, and suddenly the crowd became a human game of dominoes. One person tripped, another followed, and soon it was like a nightmare episode of human Jenga. People were so packed in that no one could move. The stampede was so tragic because by the end of it, over 150 people lost their lives and hundreds more were injured. It was so bad that emergency services couldn't even get through because of the crowd. Some people were trapped to the point where they couldn't even move a muscle, let alone call for help. Deadly shooting at Halloween party. If you've ever been to a Halloween party, then you know it's always full of people in weird, sometimes funny, and disturbing costumes. Well, that was exactly how the scene looked on Halloween night in Texas in 2021. But in the middle of the festivities, when everyone was probably debating if the pumpkin-flavored beer was actually good or if it was just a seasonal scam, gunfire erupted. And no, this wasn't some haunted house sound effect to spook the crowd. This was the real deal. Bullets started flying and the party instantly transformed from a celebration to a terrifying fight-for-your-life situation. One moment, people were grooving to Halloween tunes, and the next, they were running for cover, ducking behind anything that could stop a bullet. Tables, kegs, each other. Yeah, things got that desperate. The sea of costumes equally camouflaged the shooter, who was later identified by the police as Keontae McElroy, a 21-year-old boy who had beef with one guy at the party. The whole scene was pure chaos, as if Freddy Krueger had decided to switch careers and become a hitman. When the dust settled, one person was already dead and several others were seriously injured and bruised. Investigations started immediately after the incident, and soon the shooter was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. Manhattan terrorist attack. So picture this, you're biking along the Hudson River enjoying the fall breeze, maybe thinking about how you're going to eat all the candy your niece gave you without feeling guilty. When, out of nowhere, a pickup truck, yes, a pickup truck, the least aerodynamic vehicle ever, comes barreling down the bike path like it's auditioning for Fast and Furious the Halloween edition. Well, it was not, because this guy wasn't trick or treating, but was causing chaos and destruction. Apparently, a 29-year-old terrorist had decided that the best way to celebrate Halloween was to drive a truck into innocent people. Yes, his choice of weapon was a rented Home Depot truck. The man went full GTA mode minus the cheat codes. Now let me tell you, this wasn't just a little bump on the sidewalk. The guy plowed through people like he was Moses parting the Red Sea, except this time, instead of the sea, it was 8 lives lost and many more injured. He hit pedestrians and cyclists for over 20 freaking blocks. He stopped only when he crashed into a school bus, injuring even more people. After all that madness, this guy jumps out of the truck holding fake guns. Yes, fake. That's like bringing a water gun to a knife fight. Well, the NYPD didn't want to play games with this nutcase. They shot and apprehended him. He was later charged with terrorism and sentenced to life in prison. The Candyman poisoning. It was Halloween night 1974 in the unassuming suburb of Deer Park, Texas. 8-year-old Timothy O'Brien was dressed up and ready to trick-or-treat, probably dreaming of pillowcases overflowing with candy. Alongside his sister Elizabeth and some friends, he went door to door collecting treats in that classic Halloween tradition. Now, Timothy's dad, Ronald Clark O'Brien, was leading the group, doing the typical dad thing of pretending not to be as excited about free candy as the kids. Except this dad had a sinister plan that would give every parent nightmares for decades to come. Because you see, Ronald wasn't just out for candy, candy, he was out for cold, hard insurance money. And what better way to cash in than by turning Halloween into a twisted murder plot? His stupid, evil plan basically involved handing out pixie sticks, those sugary straws of powdery goodness, to Timothy, Elizabeth, and a few other neighborhood kids. But unknown to everyone, Ronald had laced these particular pixie sticks with cyanide, a poison so deadly it could wipe out a vampire and werewolf in one go. When the O'Briens returned home, Timothy, still riding high on Halloween excitement, asked to eat one piece of candy before bed, and Ronald conveniently suggested the pixie stick. Poor Timothy swallowed the white powder and even complained that it was bitter. Ronald once again conveniently gave him some Kool-Aid to wash away the taste. As expected, a few minutes later, the boy started convulsing, vomiting, and foaming at the mouth. Within an hour, he was dead. Trick-or-treat murderer. Just imagine getting you and your child ready to go trick-or-treating for Halloween only to end up witnessing the most horrific scene that would end up haunting you for the rest of your life. This was the unfortunate reality of the Bagley family on Halloween night 1994. It all started in the bustling streets of Las Vegas, Nevada, when Tony Bagley, just 9 years old, was doing what every kid dreams of on Halloween, dressing up as their favorite scary monster, trick-or-treating, and racking up enough candy to fuel a sugar rush for weeks. It was during this time that a random car just pulled up and an unknown assailant in a ski mask emerged. Before the family could even register what was happening, the masked figure pulled out a gun and opened fire on Tony and his family. In a split second, the innocent cries of trick-or-treaters were replaced with screams of terror. Tony was shot and collapsed onto the pavement, his little body no match for the violence that had just shattered the night. His family tried desperately to get him help, but Tony succumbed to his injuries and was dead before he even got to the hospital. The shooter fled the scene, leaving no clues, no explanation, and no answers. The police were stumped and the community was left shaken to its core. Who would target a child and his family on Halloween? Sadly, despite a massive investigation and years of detective work, no one was ever arrested for Tony Bagley's murder. Michigan, USA, 2005, double murder on Halloween. Basically, two friends, Leslie Mazzara and Adrian Insomnia, were just chilling at home doing that classic post-Halloween routine of handing out candy and calling it a night. No crazy parties, no haunted houses, just a cozy night in. Well, that's what they thought, but little did they know their night was about to get more slasher flick than they ever signed up for. So while these girls were busy having their quiet night in, an intruder quietly snuck into their house and waited silently till midnight. This guy then comes out with a knife in his hand and just starts to attack them viciously, stab them over and over and over again in this brutal, senseless act of violence. The saddest part is that after months and months of investigation, nobody knew who could have done something so horrific. But thankfully, a breakthrough came in the case in 2006 when a guy named Eric Koppel, who was friends with both victims, turned himself in. Apparently, Koppel was engaged to Leslie, and she introduced him to Adrian. But over time, Koppel began to feel insecure and jealous of Leslie's relationship with Adrian, interpreting their friendship as a threat to his engagement. While there were no romantic connections between Adrian and Koppel, he felt that Adrian's influence on Lily was pulling her away from him, which began to fester into resentment. He was sentenced to serve 2 life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. Haunted house fire. Imagine walking into a haunted house on Halloween, ready to get your socks scared off by cheap jump scares, fake cobwebs, and spooky sound effects. But instead of ghosts and ghouls, you encounter something far worse. A real-life inferno. Well, you don't need to imagine too far because this was the unfortunate and fiery reality of everyone who went to the Cleveland JC's haunted house in 1963. But basically, this haunted house was literally made out of the absolute worst, most flammable materials known to man. We're talking about cardboard, old newspapers, and even the cobwebs were flammable. The worst part is that the sad excuse of a building had only one entrance and one exit. Think about that for a second. One way in, one way out. It's like designing a maze and forgetting to add an exit door, but instead of getting lost, you get roasted. Anyways, one of the people in the house decided to smoke a cigarette in inside there, and as soon as he put on the lighter, it caught one of the cobwebs, and before you knew it, the flames broke out and it spread fast and wild. As the fire grew, the carefully curated screams of people pretending to be scared turned into actual blood-curdling terror. People pushed, shoved, and did everything short of somersaulting to get out. The chaos was as wild as Black Friday at a shopping mall. And that's not all. The smoke was thick, the flames were hot, and the building itself was a labyrinth of death. The decorations that were supposed to be spooky were now dangerously real, and there was no escape. Imagine the horror. 63 people lost their lives in that blaze, trapped and fighting desperately to make it out of the world's worst escape room. Beverly Hills, USA, 1966, the trick-or-treat murder. Beverly Hills, known for luxury, celebrities, and sunshine, isn't exactly the place you'd think a Halloween horror crime could happen. But on October 31st, 1966, this high-class neighborhood witnessed a crime that could rival any Hollywood thriller. That evening, Peter and Betty Fabiano were wrapping up Halloween, and when the candy bowl was nearly empty, they were ready to call it a night. Little did Peter know his final trick-or-treat would be the deadliest encounter of his life. Just as Peter was getting comfortable, the doorbell rang, and as Peter opened the door, instead of seeing a pint-sized Dracula, there was a masked figure standing on his porch with a gun aiming and hitting Peter straight in the chest. The shooter vanished into the night, leaving Peter in a pool of his own blood and Betty in a state of shock and terror. It wasn't long before neighbors and police arrived, but the question that haunted everyone was, who would want to kill Peter Fabiano? The whole thing seemed so random, but when investigations began, the police discovered a plot more tangled than a bowl of spaghetti. The investigation revealed that the mastermind behind the murder was none other than a woman named Joan Rabble, who was a friend of Betty's. See, Joan was head over heels in love with Betty. It was so bad that the love began to turn into an obsession, and Joan saw Peter as the obstacle standing in the way of her being with Betty, and she wasn't about to let him get in her way. But Joan didn't want to pull the trigger herself, so she convinced another woman named Goldine Pizer, who was so in love with her that she'd do anything, including murder. Well, you can already tell how this sad story of love and obsession ends. Joan and Goldine were arrested and found guilty of second-degree murder. New Jersey, USA, 1938. War of the Worlds panic. So in New Jersey, October 30th, 1938, a night before Halloween, Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater on the Air decided to put on a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel, War of the Worlds. Now, instead of doing a straightforward reading, they had the genius, or devious idea, to broadcast it as if it were a series of real news bulletins interrupting a regular music program. It was so realistic that listeners were glued to their radios thinking they were hearing a live report of an alien invasion. And, well, in 1938, people could not really go to the internet or Google to fact-check any news, so listeners had to take what they heard at face value. So when the broadcast announced that a giant alien spaceship had landed in Grover Mills, New Jersey, complete with tentacled creatures emerging and using heat ray weapons, the panic that ensued was volatile. Across New Jersey and beyond, people freaked out in ways that make modern-day apocalyptic preppers look like casual weekend campers. Some listeners ran out of their homes screaming and loading up their cars to escape the invasion. Families packed whatever they could grab, which probably included a lot of canned beans and their grandma's beloved knickknacks, and hit the road. People called the police in droves, demanding to know what the authorities were doing about the giant alien death machines supposedly roaming New Jersey. And churches filled up with people praying for salvation while others grabbed rifles ready to take on extraterrestrial invaders. The streets were pure chaos, and remember, this was before Twitter, so, the panic was legit. When the truth finally came out that the broadcast was just a super well-done radio play, the collective embarrassment must have been out of this world. People were angry, confused, and probably feeling like they'd just fallen for the biggest prank in history. Newspapers ran headlines calling it a scandal, and many accused Welles of creating mass hysteria for fun. And as for Orson Welles, he gave a press conference the next day, and while he appeared apologetic, you could almost see him mentally high-fiving himself for pulling off one of the most epic pranks in history.